Moscow, Idaho, there's a sense of safety you can't find in big cities. It's a college town where people leave their doors unlocked. In 2021, it hadn't seen a murder in 7 years. It was by every definition an American safe haven. That illusion was shattered at 4:00 a.m. on November 13, 2022. Inside a rental house on King Road, 4 university students, Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, were murdered in their beds. 4 bright futures extinguished in a matter of minutes. But the true horror isn't just the crime, it's the details. For nearly 8 hours, 2 surviving roommates on the ground floor had no idea what happened just 1 floor above them. One of them, known as DM, was frozen in fear. She reported hearing crying. She heard a voice not belonging to any of her roommates say something chilling. "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Moments later, DM opened her door to see a figure in black, masked, walking right past her. He was tall, with bushy eyebrows. He looked at her and then he just left. These students, their friends, their parents, they all believed in the safety of their small town, but they were unaware of a deadly unspoken rule that governs places like Moscow. The rule is this: the illusion of safety is the most dangerous blind spot of all. And in this case, that blind spot may have been exploited by the one person who should have understood it best. What drove a 28-year-old Ph.D. student, a man studying the very science of criminology, who researched the thoughts and feelings of killers, to allegedly commit the perfect crime? Why were these 4 chosen? Why did the killer spare the 2 roommates he walked right past? And the central, terrifying question: what really happened inside that house? What was the motive? What was going through the mind of a man who studied murder? Right before he allegedly became a monster himself? You're watching True Crime Stories. This is the Rule Files, where every case is a deadly rule broken. To understand the true gravity of what was lost on King Road, we have to move beyond the chilling headlines and the cold, hard facts of the crime itself. Before they were victims, they were 4 vibrant people, standing on the cusp of their adult lives, their futures stretching out before them like an open road. To grasp the void they left behind, we must first get to know who they were, what they dreamed of, and the incredible bonds they shared. The house at 1122 King Road wasn't just a student rental. It was a hub of friendship, a place defined by laughter, music, and the constant hum of young life. It was a home, and at the heart of that home were Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen. Kaylee was a force of nature. Described by her family as fiercely loyal and protective, she was the type of person who would defend her friends without a second thought. Her father, Steve, called her the ultimate girl's girl, a leader who was both tough and fair. At 21, she was already incredibly driven. She was just months away from graduating with a degree in general studies, and had already secured a promising IT job in Austin, Texas, a move she was incredibly excited about. As a testament to her hard work and independence, she had just bought herself a brand new Range Rover, a symbol of the successful life she was building. She was the planner, the adventurer. In fact, she and Maddie had a huge trip to Europe booked for the spring, their grand tour to celebrate graduation and the start of the rest of their lives. Kaylee was the one who made things happen, the anchor of her friend group, and the cherished daughter and sister who was, in her family's words, the pinnacle of what a person should be. Her voice was often the loudest in the room, not out of arrogance, but out of a sheer passion for life and for the people she loved. If Kaylee was the anchor, Maddie Mogen was the heart. At 21, Maddie radiated a kindness and warmth that drew people to her. Where Kaylee was the fiery protector, Maddie was the nurturing soul, the friend everyone turned to for comfort. Her smile was said to light up every room she entered. She was studying marketing and was known for her creative flair and positive attitude. The bond she shared with Kaylee was the stuff of legends. They had been inseparable since the 6th grade, a duo that navigated everything in life together. They weren't just best friends. They were, for all intents and purposes, sisters. Their social media was a tapestry of their shared life, countless pictures of them laughing, traveling, and simply being together. They had planned to be maids of honor at each other's weddings and grow old together. This wasn't a distant dream. It was an accepted fact, a cornerstone of their existence. The Europe trip was as much Maddie's dream as it was Kaylee's. For them, it was never a question of if they would do these things, only when. Maddie's light wasn't just in her friendships. It shone in every aspect of her life, from her studies to her job at a local restaurant. where she was beloved by coworkers and customers alike for her genuine sweetness. Downstairs lived 20-year-old Xana Kernodle, a ball of energy with a contagious laugh. Her family described her as a spitfire, tough, independent, and unapologetically herself, but also goofy, lighthearted, and incredibly loving. She had a strength about her that was balanced by a deep well of kindness. Like Maddie, she was a marketing major and worked at a local restaurant, the Mad Greek, where her vibrant personality made her a favorite. She was fiercely loyal, just like her upstairs roommates, and was the proud owner of a beloved dog named Shohei, who she adored. Recently, a new light had entered her life, her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. Their relationship was new but already profound. They were, by all accounts, perfect for each other, sharing a sense of humor and a zest for life. They were often seen around campus hand in hand, their happiness obvious to everyone around them. Ethan Chapin, also 20, was the embodiment of sunshine. With a wide, infectious grin that rarely left his face, he was universally loved. Ethan was a triplet, sharing an unbreakable bond with his brother Hunter and sister Maisie. They grew up in Washington, and coming to the University of Idaho together was a natural step. Ethan didn't live at the King Road house. He was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity, located just a short walk away. The only reason he was in that house on that night was because he was staying over with Xana. He was a freshman studying recreation, sport, and tourism management with a passion for sports and a deep love for his friends and family. Friends described him as the kind of guy who could make anyone laugh, the person you always wanted to be around. He was the loyal brother, the loving son, and the devoted boyfriend. His presence in that house was a simple act of love, a young man spending the night with the girl he was falling for. These were not just names on a case file. They were a fiercely loyal leader with a brand new car and a ticket to Europe, a kind-hearted soulmate who planned to see the world with her best friend, a vibrant, tough, and loving spirit with a new boyfriend, and a sun-filled young man with an unforgettable smile who was simply in the house to be with the girl he loved. They were the children, the siblings, and the friends at the center of countless lives. And as Saturday, November 12, 2022 began, they were all just living their lives, completely unaware that their time was running out. The final hours of Saturday, November 12th, unfolded with an unremarkable, almost mundane sense of normalcy. It was a weekend night like any other in a bustling college town, filled with the easy rhythms of youth and friendship. There was no premonition, no shadow of the impending doom. For the residents of 1122 King Road and their friends, it was simply a night to unwind, to socialize, and to connect, each moving through their own separate timelines that would soon tragically converge. As the sun set over Moscow, the evening began with simple plans, casual text messages, and the promise of a good time. For Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, it started as a typical girls' night out. They got ready together, the air in their rooms likely filled with music and chatter as they decided where to go. Their destination was a familiar one, the Corner Club, a popular downtown bar that was a staple of the University of Idaho's social scene. It was a place they had been to countless times, a backdrop to years of memories. Inside the bar, the atmosphere was loud and lively. Friends from class, familiar faces from around campus. It was the kind of environment where everyone seemed to know everyone. Kaylee and Maddie were in their element, socializing and enjoying the energy of the crowd. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no arguments, no tense encounters. Surveillance footage and witness accounts from that night paint a picture of two best friends simply having fun, moving through the bar, and talking with various people. They stayed for a couple of hours, soaking in the weekend atmosphere before deciding to call it a night. But the night wasn't quite over. Like so many students after a late night out, they had one final, crucial stop to make: the grub truck. This late-night food vendor, parked downtown, is an institution for Idaho students, a brightly lit beacon serving macaroni and cheese to the hungry post-bar crowd. It was here, waiting in line for their food, that the last publicly available footage of Kaylee and Maddie was captured. The video, streamed live on Twitch from the truck itself, is haunting in its normality. It shows the two girls laughing, talking to a young man in a hoodie named Jack, and ordering their food. For weeks, online sleuths would dissect this footage, assigning sinister meaning to every glance and word. But the police investigation later confirmed what the video truly shows: a perfectly normal, slightly goofy, late-night interaction. The conversation is light, revolving around their food order and some playful banter. Kaylee and Maddie are smiling. They are safe. They are just two best friends ending their night with a familiar ritual. At approximately 1:41 a.m. after getting their carbonara pasta, they did the responsible thing. They didn't walk home alone. They didn't accept a ride from a stranger. They got a ride from a private party, a service they likely used often for the short trip back to their home on King Road. They arrived safely at 1:45 a.m. Once inside, the night still lingered for Kaylee. Between 2:26 a.m. and 2:52 a.m., she made a series of phone calls to her recent ex-boyfriend, Jack DeCoeur, the same name as the young man from the grub truck, but a different person entirely. She called him multiple times, but he was asleep and didn't answer. Again, this detail was heavily scrutinized by the public, but it's a deeply human and relatable act. A late-night impulse to connect, to talk, a moment of emotion at the end of a long night. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a snapshot of a young woman's life, with all its normal complexities and lingering affections. When her calls went unanswered, the house began to settle. While Kaylee and Maddie were downtown, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were having their own fun. Their evening was spent at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, where Ethan was a member. It was just a 5-minute walk from 1122 King Road, another cornerstone of the university's social fabric. Inside, a party was underway. Like their friends at the Corner Club, Xana and Ethan were surrounded by familiar faces, laughing and spending time together as a couple. By all accounts, their night was equally uneventful. They were happy, in love, and enjoying the company of their friends. They left the party and walked back to King Road, arriving almost at the exact same time as Kaylee and Maddie, around 1:45 a.m. The house, which had been quiet, was now full again, with all 4 of its residents for the night back under one roof. Also present in the house were the 2 other roommates, who thankfully would become the 2 survivors. Bethany Funk was in her bedroom on the 1st floor, the basement level of the uniquely structured house. Dylan Mortensen was on the 2nd floor, the same floor as Xana's bedroom. They had their own plans that night and had returned home earlier. As the 4 other friends arrived back, the house was settling into its final state for the night. The separate threads of their evenings had all come together. There was one final, chillingly routine event to occur. At approximately 4 a.m., a DoorDash delivery arrived at the house. The order was for Xana. This single transaction, captured digitally, confirms that Xana was awake, likely on her phone and possibly eating a late-night snack, just moments before the estimated time of the attack. It's a detail that adds an almost unbearable layer of tension to the timeline. The idea that she was awake, scrolling on her phone while the threat was silently closing in. After that DoorDash delivery, the digital trail goes cold. The phone calls stopped. The text messages ended. The social media posts ceased. The house at 1122 King Road, which had been filled with life and movement just hours before, finally fell completely silent. All 6 of its young occupants were inside, 4 of them victims, 2 of them survivors. They were home. They were together. They believed they were safe. The setup was now complete, every piece in its place. Outside in the cold pre-dawn darkness of Moscow, Idaho, a different kind of timeline was just beginning. As the house on King Road finally fell into a deep and vulnerable silence, the world outside was not as still as it seemed. The quiet streets of Moscow, usually empty in the cold hours before dawn, held a secret. An Omen, mechanical and silent, was methodically tracing a path through the darkness. For weeks after the murders, as the public grew frantic and the media speculated wildly, the investigation's most crucial clue was hiding in plain sight, captured in fragments of grainy, low-resolution video from a dozen different angles. It was a ghost in the machine, a predator on wheels. A white 2015 Hyundai Elantra. This car wasn't just a random vehicle that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The digital breadcrumbs it left behind would eventually tell a terrifying story of obsession, surveillance, and meticulous patient planning. The Elantra was not just a car. It was the harbinger of death. Long before the world knew the names of the victims, a painstaking process was unfolding behind the scenes. Detectives began a massive digital canvas, requesting surveillance footage from every home and business within a several-mile radius of the crime scene. They weren't just looking at the hours surrounding the murders. They were going back weeks, then months. As they stitched together this digital tapestry, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The white Elantra wasn't a new presence in the area. It had been there before. In fact, analysis of cell phone data and video footage would later reveal that the vehicle associated with Bryan Kohberger had pinged in the vicinity of the King Road home on at least 12 separate occasions prior to November 13th. These weren't daytime visits or casual drive-bys. Almost every instance occurred in the dead of night or the earliest hours of the morning, the exact same window of time in which the murders would eventually take place. It was a pattern of surveillance. A hunter studying its prey's territory, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood, noting the moments of greatest quiet and vulnerability. Each late-night pass was a rehearsal, a silent, methodical confirmation of the plan. This single, chilling fact transformed the narrative from a possible crime of passion to a premeditated act of stalking. With this history of surveillance established, the movements of the white Elantra on the night of November 13th became a terrifying real-time blueprint of the attack. The journey began in Pullman, Washington, a town just a 10-mile drive across the state line, where Bryan Kohberger lived and studied. At 2:42 a.m., his white Elantra is captured on a surveillance camera heading east, leaving Pullman and crossing into his home state of Idaho. By 2:53 a.m., it's picked up by a camera in Moscow, having entered the city. But it doesn't proceed directly to the target. Instead, it begins a series of slow, deliberate loops around the residential district where the King Road house is located. It is seen driving south on a nearby street, then north. At one point, it's captured on camera attempting a three-point turn, a clumsy maneuver in the dark that speaks to a driver either unfamiliar with the dead-end street or trying to position the vehicle just right. It circles the neighborhood 3 times, each pass bringing it closer to the house. This wasn't a lost driver. This was a predator closing its circle, ensuring the coast was clear, perhaps building its own courage. Then, after the third loop, the Elantra disappears from the view of the nearby cameras. It has found its spot. The final critical approach begins. At 4:04 a.m., the white Elantra is seen for the last time on camera, creeping slowly past the house on King Road. Then, it vanishes from sight, presumably having parked nearby, out of the view of any lens. The stalking was over. The attack was imminent. For the next 16 minutes, there is only an unnerving digital silence. But the real world was not silent. At approximately 4:17 a.m., a security camera on a property just 50 feet from Xana's bedroom wall, while not capturing video of the house, recorded something horrifying. Its highly sensitive microphone picked up distorted audio, first what sounded like whimpering, then a loud thud, and immediately following, a dog, likely Kaylee's dog Murphy, began barking frantically and repeatedly. The sounds of a struggle, a life being taken, and an animal's desperate alarm, all captured by a cold, unfeeling machine. The Omen had delivered its message. Just 3 minutes later, at 4:20 a.m., the white Elantra suddenly reappears on camera. It is no longer moving slowly. It is seen leaving the area at a high rate of speed, accelerating quickly down the residential streets and heading southwest, away from the scene. The methodical, patient predator was now a fleeing killer, making a rapid escape back towards the Washington state line. The journey that began with slow, deliberate circles ended in a desperate, high-speed flight. The car, which had arrived as a silent threat, now carried the weight of an unspeakable secret. Back inside the house at 1122 King Road, the barking eventually subsided. A new, permanent silence descended upon the home. The Omen was gone, but the horror it brought had just begun, waiting in the darkness for the morning sun to reveal its terrible work. As the white Elantra sped back towards Washington, leaving a trail of digital ghosts in its wake, the house at 1122 King Road remained a silent tomb. The sun rose on Sunday, November 13th, casting its morning light on a town that was slowly waking up, completely oblivious to the carnage that lay hidden behind the walls of a single student home. For nearly 8 agonizing hours, an eternity of stillness, the horrific secret was kept. This gap in time, between the killer's departure around 4:20 a.m. and the first call for help just before noon, has become one of the most haunting and debated aspects of the entire case. Inside the house, the 2 surviving roommates, Bethany Funke and Dylan Mortensen, were on the first and second floors, respectively. They were alive, and presumably for most of that morning simply thought their housemates were sleeping off a late Saturday night. It's a chillingly normal assumption, a scenario that plays out in college houses across the country every Sunday morning. The hours ticked by. The usual sounds of a waking house, footsteps on the stairs, the coffee pot brewing, chatter from the living room, were absent. It's believed that as the morning progressed, a quiet unease began to set in. The silence became heavier, more unnatural. We don't know the exact moment their mild concern turned to genuine worry, but we know that at some point, the two survivors began to reach out. They texted their friends who hadn't come home. They called them. When those calls went unanswered, they began summoning other friends to the house, likely hoping to get help waking their roommates, perhaps still believing they were merely unresponsive after a long night. It was a slow, creeping realization, a puzzle being assembled piece by agonizing piece. Friends began to arrive, entering a house that was eerily quiet. They called out the names of their friends. They knocked on their bedroom doors. There was no response. It was this group of friends, summoned to the house in a state of growing concern, who would make the terrible discovery. Finally, at 11:58 a.m., a cell phone in the house dialed 911. The call, made from one of the surviving roommates' phones, was frantic and confusing. The dispatcher on the other end heard multiple people talking in the background, a sign of the chaos and panic unfolding at the scene. The reporting party didn't describe a murder scene. They didn't mention blood or a weapon. The term they used was an unconscious person. This specific phrase would later fuel endless unfair speculation and criticism aimed at the survivors. But put into context, it's the language of utter shock and disbelief. A young person, faced with an unimaginable sight, struggles to process what they are seeing. Their mind defaults to the most logical, albeit incorrect, explanation. They hadn't stumbled upon a crime scene. They had found a friend who wouldn't wake up. It was only when the first police officers arrived, their training and experience cutting through the civilian panic, that the true, horrific nature of the situation was finally understood. The first officers from the Moscow Police Department arrived within minutes. What they encountered was not a medical emergency, but a scene of almost unimaginable violence. Their body cameras were rolling, capturing footage that has since been sealed, deemed too horrific for public viewing. The officers moved methodically through the house, clearing it room by room, and with each step the scale of the tragedy grew. On the second floor, they found the bodies of Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. On the third floor, they discovered the bodies of best friends Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen in the same bed. The scene was later described by seasoned law enforcement officials as the worst they had ever witnessed in their careers. The initial 911 call for a single unconscious individual had escalated into a complex multi-victim homicide investigation. Within minutes, the house was sealed. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the property, a stark and sudden barrier that transformed a simple college rental into a national headline. The illusion of Moscow's safety, which had been chipped away in the darkness, was now officially and brutally shattered in the light of day. As detectives and forensic teams descended upon the house, the news began to spread like wildfire. First through text messages and hushed phone calls among the student body, then through local news alerts, and finally to the national media. The initial reports were confused and contradictory. A standoff? A crime of passion? A robbery gone wrong? The Moscow police chief, James Fry, made his first public statement, his face etched with the gravity of the situation. He tried to reassure a terrified community, initially stating he believed it was an isolated, targeted attack, and that there was no imminent risk to the community. But without a suspect in custody, without a weapon, and without a clear motive, his words offered little comfort. For the students of the University of Idaho and the residents of Moscow, the terror was palpable. A monster had struck, and nobody knew who it was, why they had done it, or if they would strike again. Parents drove for hours to pull their children out of school. Students barricaded themselves in their dorm rooms. The town that had prided itself on its safety was now paralyzed by fear. The investigation had just begun, but it was already clear this was no ordinary crime. The police were faced with a brutal, silent killer who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a house of horrors and a community drowning in unanswered questions. While the police swarmed the exterior of 1122 King Road, Piecing together timelines from cameras and digital data, the most crucial and mystifying piece of the puzzle lay within the traumatized memory of one of the survivors. The investigation had a ghost car and a digital footprint, but it lacked a face, a form, a human description of the killer. That was about to change. As investigators gently and carefully debriefed the surviving roommates, the account given by the young woman known as DM sent a shockwave through the entire case. Her testimony was a key that unlocked the 4-hour window of the attack, providing a terrifying, first-hand glimpse into the events that transpired on the second floor. It was a story so strange and so specific that it introduced a profound and esoteric mystery into the heart of the investigation: the mystery of the man in black. According to the probable cause affidavit, DM's ordeal began at approximately 4 a.m. She was asleep in her bedroom on the second floor, the same floor as Xana Kernodle's room, when she was jolted awake. The sounds she heard were muffled but distinct. At first she thought it was Kaylee playing with her dog Murphy in one of the upstairs bedrooms. It was a normal domestic sound that initially caused no alarm. A short time later she heard what she thought was Kaylee's voice say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." The casualness of the phrase hung in the air, a statement of fact, not yet of fear. But then, the auditory landscape of the house began to shift. The sounds became more distressing. DM told police she heard crying coming from the direction of Xana's room. The innocent sounds of a dog playing had been replaced by the unmistakable sound of human distress. And then came the sentence that would echo through every document and news report on the case. Through the wall, she heard a male voice, calm and steady, say a single chilling phrase: "It's okay. I'm going to help you." In the context of the crying, the words are deeply unsettling. Were they meant to be reassuring, a twisted form of comfort offered by a killer? Or were they a cold, sarcastic statement, a final cruel taunt? The ambiguity is terrifying. It's a phrase that makes no sense in the context of a brutal attack, and it provided investigators with the first psychological clue into the killer's mindset. This was not a frenzied, screaming attacker. This was someone controlled, someone capable of speech, someone who was perhaps even trying to manipulate his victim in her final moments. The sound of that voice, followed by the crying, prompted DM to do what anyone would do. She looked out of her bedroom door to see what was happening. She opened her door twice, peering into the hallway, but saw nothing. The house was dark, the sounds were confusing, and a deep sense of unease was likely setting in. But it was the third time she opened her door that etched a permanent image of terror into her mind. Standing in the hallway, illuminated by the faint glow of a decorative light, was a figure. It was a man, clad entirely in black clothing and a mask that covered his mouth and nose, obscuring his face. But his eyes and the area around them were visible. DM described him as being 5'10" or taller, not overly muscular but athletically built, with bushy eyebrows. It was a description so specific, so jarringly detailed, that it could only come from a moment of pure, undiluted focus. For a few seconds that must have felt like an eternity. She stared at the man who had just brought murder into her home. And then, the most inexplicable part of her account occurred. The man in black didn't turn towards her. He didn't seem to register her as a threat or even as a witness. He simply walked past her bedroom door, heading directly for the backsliding glass door that served as the main exit for the second floor. DM told police she stood there in a frozen shock phase, a state of complete and utter paralysis, a common response to extreme trauma. She was locked in place, watching the killer who had just murdered her friends, and he just ignored her. He walked past her and disappeared into the night. This single act, or rather this act of omission, became the central, esoteric mystery of the crime. Why did he spare her? Did he not see her clearly in the dim light? Did he see her but in his post-homicidal state simply fail to process her presence? Or was it an act of arrogance, a belief that he was so superior, so untouchable, that he could afford to leave a witness behind? This question has profound implications. If he didn't see her, it suggests a degree of fallibility, a mistake made in the chaos of the moment. If he did see her and chose to let her live, it points to a level of confidence and control that is even more terrifying. It would mean he was so certain of his escape, so sure of his own intellectual superiority, that a single eyewitness didn't matter. DM's testimony was a bombshell. It gave investigators their first physical description of the suspect, a crucial detail that would eventually be compared against Bryan Kohberger. right down to the height and the now infamous bushy eyebrows. But more than that, it provided a chilling psychological portrait. This wasn't a phantom or a ghost. This was a real, physical man who was calm enough to speak, methodical enough to navigate the house, and either careless enough or arrogant enough to leave a living witness in his wake. Her account transformed the case from a whodunit into a hunt for a specific person, the man in black who walked out of a house of horrors and left one final confounding mystery behind. While the testimony of the surviving roommate provided a chilling human element to the investigation, modern policing knows that memories, especially those forged in trauma, can be fallible. To secure a conviction, detectives needed something more. They needed physical, irrefutable evidence, something the killer had touched, something he had left behind. They needed a mistake, and in the chaotic, violent aftermath of his rampage, the man in black had made one. It was a small oversight, an object no bigger than a man's hand, but it would ultimately become his undoing. As forensic teams meticulously processed the third-floor bedroom where Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were found, they discovered something that did not belong. Lying on the bed, partially tucked under Madison's body, was a tan leather knife sheath. It was a crucial, case-altering discovery. The sheath itself immediately provided vital clues. It was stamped with the distinctive Ka-Bar brand logo, along with the United States Marine Corps USMC insignia. This wasn't just any knife. The Ka-Bar is a famous military and fighting knife, known for its size and lethality. This detail immediately gave investigators a potential profile of the murder weapon, a large single-edged blade, consistent with the horrific wounds suffered by the victims. But the sheath's true value was not in what it held, but in what was on its surface. In the world of forensics, every surface is a potential goldmine of information. The most valuable, and often the most elusive, is DNA. As investigators examined the sheath, their attention was drawn to the small button snap used to secure the knife in place. It was the one point on the object a person would have to press firmly with a thumb or finger to close it. And on that small metallic surface, they found what they were looking for: a single, statistical source of male DNA. This type of evidence is known as touch DNA, or trace DNA. It's the microscopic collection of skin cells that we shed and leave behind on everything we touch. Finding a clean, unmixed sample at a bloody, chaotic crime scene is extraordinarily rare and incredibly valuable. This wasn't a sample from the victims, nor was it from anyone else who lived in the house. It was a ghost signature, a biological calling card left behind by the killer. The FBI was immediately tasked with running the sample through CODIS, the National Criminal Justice DNA database, hoping for a match to a known offender. The result came back negative. The killer, whoever he was not already in the system. While disappointing, this was also a vital piece of the puzzle. It meant their suspect was likely a so-called ghost with no prior felony convictions. The DNA profile became their John Doe, a genetic blueprint of the murderer, waiting for a name to be attached to it. But the sheath wasn't the only piece of physical evidence recovered. As forensic teams swept the floors, they discovered a second, subtle clue near the sliding glass door where the killer had made his exit. It was a latent shoe print, a faint impression left behind on the floor. After careful analysis, investigators were able to identify the pattern: a diamond shape, similar to the tread on a pair of Vans brand sneakers. It was another small but significant detail. It gave them an idea of the killer's footwear, and provided another item to look for when they eventually identified a suspect. It was a piece that, when combined with the sheath and the witness description, began to paint a more detailed picture of the man in black. He was tall, wore Vans-style shoes, and carried a large, military-style knife. While the forensic team worked inside, another group of investigators was focused on a third, and equally important trail of evidence, the digital one. They began the arduous process of mapping out the cellular data from the towers that serviced the King Road neighborhood. They were looking for any phone that exhibited the same suspicious pattern of movement as the white Elantra. Specifically, they were searching for a device that had traveled from the Pullman area to the King Road neighborhood and back during the narrow window of the murders. They also looked for a crucial anomaly, a phone that had been turned off or switched to airplane mode just before the attack, only to be turned back on shortly after, as the Elantra was seen speeding away. This is a classic tactic used by criminals attempting to hide their location from cell towers. The data was a haystack of millions of connections, but the investigators were looking for one very specific needle. The physical evidence from the scene, the DNA on the sheath, the shoe print on the floor, was the anchor. The digital evidence from the cell towers would be the net. The investigators now had the killer's DNA without a name, a description of his shoes, and a precise digital pattern to search for. They had all the pieces. Now they just needed to find the one person in the world who fit them all. For 6 long, agonizing weeks, the investigation went dark. To the outside world, it seemed as if the case had stalled, a frustrating and terrifying silence that settled over the holidays. The public, fueled by rampant social media speculation and a grieving community's desperate need for answers, grew increasingly critical of the Moscow Police Department. They were seen as being tight-lipped, ineffective, and out of their depth. But behind the wall of official silence, a storm of investigative activity was gathering force. The John Doe DNA profile from the knife sheath was their ace in the hole, and investigators were meticulously building a case, refusing to make a move until every piece was perfectly aligned. The revelation was coming, not with a sudden flash, but through a slow, methodical, and relentless hunt that stretched from coast to coast. The first domino to fall was the car. The white Hyundai Elantra, the ghost that haunted the grainy surveillance footage, became the investigation's primary focus. On December 7th, nearly a month after the murders, police made a public plea, releasing a stock photo of the vehicle and asking for any information regarding its whereabouts. This was a strategic move. They already had a strong suspicion of who the driver was, but they needed to close the net. The public announcement sent a shockwave through the national consciousness, and tips began pouring in. But the most important tip had already been logged. On November 29th, a campus police officer at Washington State University in Pullman had run a search for white Elantras registered to students or staff. He got a hit, a 2015 model registered to a Ph.D. student named Bryan Kohberger. This was the moment the faceless investigation finally got a name. With a name came a face, a history, and most importantly, a driver's license photo and a physical address. The man in the photo, with his intense stare and prominent eyebrows, bore a striking resemblance to the description given by the surviving roommate. Damn. The address was an apartment complex in Pullman, just a 10-minute drive from the crime scene. Suddenly, all the disparate threads of the investigation began weaving together around this one individual. Investigators immediately secured a warrant for his cell phone records. The data came back and it was a bombshell. The records showed Kohberger's phone traveling from Pullman to Moscow on the night of the murders, following a path perfectly consistent with the Elantra's movements. Critically, the data showed his phone went silent, likely turned off at 2:47 a.m., and only powered back on at 4:48 a.m., just south of Moscow, as he was making his escape. The digital ghost now had a name and a phone number. As the FBI began intensive surveillance on Kohberger, he made a move that both complicated and aided their investigation. In mid-December, he and his father embarked on a long, cross-country road trip, driving the 2,500 miles from Pullman, Washington, to his family's home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania for the winter holidays. This drive became a crucial period of observation for the FBI. As the white Elantra made its way across the country, it was being tracked. In Indiana, the car was pulled over twice on the same day by 2 different law enforcement agencies for minor traffic infractions, such as following too closely. These stops, which seemed routine at the time, were anything but. They were a calculated maneuver by the FBI to get a clear look at the suspect, to see his hands, to observe his demeanor, all without tipping him off that he was the primary suspect in a quadruple homicide. Once Kohberger arrived at his parents' home in the Pocono Mountains, the final phase of the operation began. The FBI's surveillance was covert and constant. They needed one final irrefutable piece of evidence to tie the DNA on the knife sheath directly to him. They found their opportunity in the pre-dawn darkness of December 27th. Federal agents working with Pennsylvania State Police conducted a trash pull, secretly collecting the Kohberger family's garbage from the curb before the sanitation trucks arrived. The bags were flown to a state lab in Idaho, where forensic scientists worked quickly to find a viable DNA sample. They found one on a discarded item and were able to extract a profile belonging to Kohberger's father. Using advanced techniques in investigative genetic genealogy, they compared this paternal DNA to the John Doe profile from the knife sheath. The result was exactly what they had hoped for. The DNA on the sheath belonged to a male offspring of the man whose trash they had collected. The probability was over 99.99%. They had him. With this final scientific confirmation, the case was sealed. An arrest warrant was issued for Bryan Kohberger on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. In the early hours of December 30th, the quiet, wooded neighborhood of Albrightsville was shattered by the arrival of a heavily armed Pennsylvania State Police SWAT team and FBI agents. They surrounded the house using a battering ram to smash through the door and windows. Inside, they found a shocked Bryan Kohberger, who was arrested without incident. News of the arrest broke across the country like a thunderclap. After 6 weeks of silence and fear, there was a name and a face. The suspect wasn't a drifter or a known violent criminal. He was something far more chilling, something nobody had expected. The initial revelation was complete, but it only opened the door to a far more profound and disturbing question, one that would become the central theme of the entire case. Who exactly was Bryan Kohberger? The arrest of Bryan Kohberger sent a wave of relief through the nation, but it was immediately followed by a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. The man in the orange jumpsuit, the face of a quadruple homicide, was not the uneducated drifter or hardened felon that many had imagined. The true revelation, the one that elevated this case from a tragic murder to a subject of deep psychological horror, was his identity in the world. He was a scholar of crime. Bryan Kohberger was a Ph.D. student in criminology and criminal justice, a man whose entire adult life had been dedicated to one single obsessive pursuit: understanding the minds of killers. This wasn't just his major, it was his passion. And this great, terrible irony would become the defining feature of the entire case, forcing a terrifying question into the public consciousness. What happens when the person studying the monster in the abyss becomes the monster himself? To understand the depth of this irony, one must look at his academic journey. Kohberger wasn't a newcomer to the field. He had earned both a bachelor's degree in psychology and a Master of Arts in Criminal Justice from DeSales University in Pennsylvania. By all accounts, he was a brilliant, if unsettling, student. Former classmates and professors described him as highly intelligent, driven, and intensely focused, but also as socially awkward and argumentative. He reportedly had a tendency to dominate class discussions, often debating the nuances of criminal theory with a cold, detached logic that left some of his peers feeling uneasy. One former classmate recalled a specific instance in a class discussion about forensics, where Kohberger was the only student to argue that the TV show Dexter was an accurate portrayal of a serial killer's mind, a comment that seemed oddly out of place. He wasn't just interested in the why of crime. He seemed fascinated by the how, by the mechanics of planning, execution, and evasion. After completing his master's degree in June of 2022, he took the next logical step for a dedicated academic. He enrolled in the prestigious Ph.D. program at Washington State University, located in Pullman, just a 15-minute drive across the state line from Moscow, Idaho. He was a teaching assistant, a researcher, a man on the path to becoming a professor, an expert who would one day teach others about the very subject that now defined his infamy. He was living within the ecosystem of law and order, studying the behavior of those who break the social contract. He read the same textbooks and analyzed the same case files as the very detectives who were now hunting him. He understood forensic science, he understood police procedure, and most chillingly, he understood the common mistakes that lead to a criminal's capture. He was, in theory, the last person who should have been a suspect. But the most damning piece of this psychological puzzle comes directly from Kohberger himself. As part of his graduate studies, he posted a survey on Reddit, seeking former offenders to help him with a research project. The questions he asked, when read in the chilling light of the Idaho murders, are nothing short of a confession of his obsessions. They read like a murderer's personal journal, a checklist for committing the perfect crime. He asked, "How did you select your victim? How did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? What was the first move you made in order to accomplish your goal?" He delved deep into the emotional and logistical process, asking about their state of mind, their methods of entry, and how they traveled to and from the target. And then perhaps the most revealing question of all, after committing the crime, what was the first thing you did? He was, in essence, crowdsourcing a manual for murder from the only people who could provide it: convicted criminals. This wasn't just academic curiosity. It was a methodical inquiry into the entire life cycle of a violent crime, from the initial fantasy to the final getaway. He was studying how to choose a target, how to maintain emotional control, and how to avoid getting caught. This research project provides a terrifying window into his mind. It suggests that for Bryan Kohberger, the study of crime was not a preventative science but a prescriptive one. It was a way to learn from the mistakes of others, to refine the process, and to theoretically achieve what so many others had failed to do: commit the perfect crime. His academic pursuits and his alleged criminal actions appear to be two sides of the same coin. A feedback loop where his research informed his alleged planning, and his alleged desires fueled his research. This brings us to the ultimate tragic irony of the criminology student. For all his study, for all his intellectual understanding of how killers are caught, he allegedly made a classic devastating error. He left behind the knife sheath, bearing his DNA at the scene of the crime. It's the kind of mistake a first-year forensics student would be taught to avoid. It suggests that no amount of academic knowledge can prepare a person for the chaotic, violent reality of murder. The detached, logical mind of the researcher was perhaps overwhelmed by the adrenaline and brutality of the act itself. This is the central rule of the Bryan Kohberger case, the one that makes it so uniquely horrifying. The most dangerous predator is not always the one who flouts the rules in ignorance, but the one who has mastered them, who studies them, and who believes his intelligence makes him immune to them. Bryan Kohberger's knowledge was not a shield for society. It was allegedly a sword he sharpened in the classroom, only to allegedly turn it on 4 innocent young people in the dead of night. While the study of Bryan Kohberger's academic life provides a chilling psychological portrait, it is the cold, impartial, and relentless data from his digital life that forms the backbone of the prosecution's case. In the modern world, we all leave a legacy, a trail of invisible breadcrumbs scattered across a vast network of cellular towers and social media servers. This is the ghost in the machine, a detailed, time-stamped record of our movements, our interests, and our connections. For a man who academically studied how to commit the perfect crime, Bryan Kohberger's alleged failure to manage his own digital footprint would prove to be his most critical vulnerability. The data, once compiled, did not just place him at the scene of the crime. It painted a disturbing picture of a lengthy and methodical obsession. The most damning evidence comes from the device he carried everywhere: his cell phone. By securing a warrant for all the historical location data associated with his number, investigators were able to essentially create a map of his life, and that map led them time and time again to one specific fateful location. The data revealed that in the 5 months leading up to the murders, from June 2022 onwards, Kohberger's phone had connected to cell towers providing service to the 1122 King Road residents on at least 12 separate occasions. This was not a coincidence. This was not a case of him simply being in the general Moscow area. The pings were specific and the pattern was terrifyingly consistent. Almost every single one of these visits occurred in the late hours of the night or the desolate pre-dawn hours of the morning. It was the digital corroboration of the Omen from Part 4, the stalking white Elantra. The car was the physical manifestation of the hunt, but the phone was the silent, invisible record of the hunter's presence. He was allegedly casing the location, learning the neighborhood's rhythms, and observing the home of his future victims, all under the cover of darkness. This pattern of digital surveillance culminates in the night of the attack. His phone's journey that night is a precise, minute-by-minute ledger of the crime. At 2:42 a.m., his phone pings a tower in Pullman, Washington. Just 5 minutes later, at 2:47 a.m., the data stops. The phone abruptly ceases all communication with the cellular network. This is not a random dead battery or a dropped signal. This is a deliberate act. An individual attempting to mask their location would either turn their phone off completely or switch it to airplane mode. For the next 2 hours during the exact window of the murders, Bryan Kohberger's digital ghost vanished from the grid. It was an act of a person who, according to prosecutors, knew he was about to do something he did not want tracked. Then, just as abruptly as it disappeared, the ghost returned. At 4:48 a.m., Kohberger's phone suddenly powers back on and connects to a cell tower far south of Moscow, near the town of Genesee, Idaho. This is crucial. Instead of taking the most direct route back to Pullman, a straight shot down the main highway, the phone's data shows it taking a circuitous roundabout path through the rural backroads of Idaho and Washington. It was a route that deliberately avoided the city of Moscow and the main arteries of traffic, the path of someone actively trying to avoid being seen, to avoid cameras, to avoid any potential witnesses in the minutes after the crime. The phone's journey ends back in Pullman, pinging a tower near his apartment at approximately 5:30 a.m. The digital round trip was complete. It showed a deliberate journey to the target, a deliberate effort to go dark during the attack, and a deliberate evasive route for the escape. But the digital legacy wasn't just about location data. It also extended to his online social life, or lack thereof, and it potentially provided the first real clue as to the why behind this horrific crime. As investigators dug into his online presence, they reportedly discovered an Instagram account belonging to Kohberger. And on that account, they found a faint, one-sided connection to the victims. According to an investigator who spoke with People magazine, Kohberger's account had repeatedly sent a series of direct messages, or DMs, to one of the female victims in the weeks leading up to the murders. It started with a simple, "Hey." When there was no reply, he tried again about a week later. Still silence. He continued to send more messages, but the victim never engaged, never responded. She may not have even seen them. To her, he was just another random profile, a ghost in her DMs. But to him, her silence may have been deafening. This wasn't a two-way connection. It was an unreciprocated advance. This single detail, if proven true, recontextualizes the entire crime. It shifts the motive from a random thrill-seeking act to something far more personal and venomous. A crime potentially fueled by a deep-seated sense of rejection and inadequacy. The victims were no longer anonymous figures. One of them, at least, had become the specific object of his unrequited attention. His digital legacy, therefore, wasn't just a map of his movements. It was a potential window into his motive, a trail of evidence that documented not only where his body was, but where his mind may have been as well. With a suspect in custody, a mountain of physical and digital evidence, and an eyewitness account, the practical question of who had seemingly been answered. The investigation had successfully identified its target. But as the case transitioned from a frantic manhunt to the slow, deliberate grind of the justice system, the arrest of Bryan Kohberger did not quiet the most profound question of all. In fact, it only made it louder. It's a question that forensics cannot answer, that data cannot explain, and that echoes in the hearts of the victims' families every single day. Why? What was the motive? What possible reason could exist for such a brutal, intimate, and devastating act of violence? This central black hole in the narrative is where the case now resides, a space filled only with theories, speculation, and the agonizing wait for a trial. One of the most prominent theories, fueled by the reported Instagram DMs, centers on a motive as old as humanity itself: rejection. In this scenario, Bryan Kohberger is seen as a socially isolated man, an incel-type figure whose academic intelligence masked a profound social inadequacy. The victims, particularly the young women in the house, represented a world he could observe but never truly be a part of, a world of effortless friendship, romance, and social acceptance. His unreciprocated messages were not just a failed attempt at connection. They were another confirmation of his own perceived invisibility and rejection. In this view, the murders were an act of horrific misogynistic rage. It was the ultimate act of a man who, unable to possess or control the objects of his obsession, chose instead to destroy them. It's a theory that paints the crime as deeply personal, a final, violent lashing out against a world he felt had shut him out. A second, and perhaps even more chilling theory, divorces the crime from personal emotion and connects it directly to his academic pursuits. This is the perfect crime theory. In this narrative, Kohberger is a narcissist of the highest order, an intellectual who saw the world as his personal laboratory. The years spent studying criminal minds were not for the purpose of prevention, but for perfection. The victims were not chosen out of personal animus, but because they fit a certain profile and their home presented a suitable challenge. The murders in this scenario were the ultimate final exam for his Ph.D., a practical application of his research. The goal was not personal vengeance, but the thrill of execution and the satisfaction of outsmarting the very system he had studied for years. This theory suggests a man devoid of normal human emotion, a predator who saw other people not as human beings, but as variables in a dark and terrible equation. As these theories swirl, the real-world legal battle has been defined by a frustrating but necessary silence. Bryan Kohberger has remained a stoic, almost blank figure in his court appearances. When asked to enter a plea, he chose a tactic known as standing silent, refusing to say either guilty or not guilty. This forced the judge to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf, officially setting the stage for a trial. Almost immediately, the judge issued a sweeping gag order, legally barring anyone involved in the case, from the prosecution and defense attorneys to the police and the victims' families, from speaking publicly about any details. This order was designed to prevent a media circus and ensure Kohberger's right to a fair trial. But it has also created an information vacuum, leaving the public and the families in a painful state of limbo, desperate for new information. The silence was only recently broken by a stunning, if vague, filing from Kohberger's defense team. In the summer of 2024, they officially presented his alibi. At the time of the murders, Bryan Kohberger was not at 1122 King Road but was out driving alone, as he often did, to hike or look at the stars. It's an alibi that is both difficult to prove and difficult to disprove. But prosecutors were quick to point out that this claim does nothing to contradict their evidence. In fact, it conveniently places him outside of his home, in his car, during the exact window of time that his cell phone data and the white Elantra's movements show him driving to, and then fleeing from, the crime scene. The stage is now set for one of the most highly anticipated criminal trials in modern American history. A legal battle where the death penalty is on the table, and where these competing narratives of motive and opportunity will finally collide. But while the world waits for legal closure, it is the families of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan who are left to navigate the unbearable space between what happened and why. For them, a conviction is only one part of justice. The other, more elusive part is understanding. The Goncalves family, in particular, has been vocal about their relentless pursuit of the truth, vowing to be a voice for their daughter in court. In a statement, they made their mission clear. "It's a long road ahead," they wrote, "but we will be there every step of the way, fighting for our children and the truth." For them, and for all the families torn apart by this tragedy, the unanswered questions are not an academic exercise. They are a daily torment, a wound that cannot begin to heal until the final, most important question of all is finally, definitively, answered. The case of the Idaho 4 is a story that began with a scream in the dark and ended with a suspect who had spent his life studying the silence that follows. We have traced the path of a ghost car through the quiet streets of Moscow. We have stood in a state of frozen shock with a terrified roommate, and we have followed a trail of digital and biological evidence across the entire country. The journey led us to the most unlikely of places. Not a shadowy underworld, but the sterile academic halls of a university. It led us to a man who possessed all the intellectual tools to understand the anatomy of a murder, and who now stands accused of using that knowledge to perform a horrific dissection of 4 young lives. The trial of Bryan Kohberger will ultimately determine legal guilt or innocence, but the story has already revealed a terrifying truth, a lesson that serves as the final, chilling entry in this case file. We are left with a mosaic of damning evidence. The DNA on a knife sheath, a cell phone that goes dark at the critical moment, and a history of digital stalking that suggests a long-held obsession. We have an eyewitness description of a man with bushy eyebrows and a suspect who fits that description. Yet we are also left with a profound and unsettling void where a motive should be. Was this an act of violent rejection, a crime of incel rage, or was it the ultimate intellectual exercise, a real-world thesis written in blood by a student of murder? We may never know for certain what truly transpired in his mind, but we are forced to confront the central, terrifying rule that this case has laid bare. The most dangerous predator isn't always the one who breaks the rules out of ignorance, but the one who has mastered them, using knowledge not as a shield, but as a weapon. The case of Bryan Kohberger is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears the mask of intellectual curiosity. It can hide in plain sight, camouflaged by academic achievement and the quiet, unassuming life of a graduate student. The rule he allegedly broke was not just the law of the land, but a fundamental rule of humanity, the one that separates the study of darkness from the act of embracing it. The investigation and the upcoming trial will continue to unfold, and we will be watching every step of the way. But now the conversation turns to you. What do you believe? Out of all the evidence presented, the DNA, the cell phone data, the eyewitness account, which piece do you find to be the most compelling, the one that serves as the undeniable linchpin of the case? And what is your theory on the ultimate unanswered question? What was the true motive behind this horrific act? Let me know your thoughts and your theories in the comment section below. If you found this investigation compelling, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to True Crime Stories. Make sure you also ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. You won't want to miss our next episode of the Rule Files, where we will investigate another case and another deadly rule that was shattered. Thank you for watching.